Hello the world, hello politicos, hello internet, hello Jason Isaacs, hello to our live studio audience. Hello. Yes, they promised to be very good, and this is the second time we've tried this, and they're being very patient. But hopefully we've captured some of the spontaneity and some of the magic. Let's push on with the presentation, because there's a lot here, and obviously 15 minutes is my cutoff. So, you should by now know that within federalism we have this two systems of government, each of which sets its own set of rules. So we have one federal government for the entire United States, passing federal laws which all states must obey. And then within that we have this, underneath that, if you will, we have a patchwork of governments operating essentially on a sort of fractal model, whereby we see each state running its own executive, legislature and judiciary, and consequently, yes, their own different set of rules, which ideally should respond and be fitted to the demands and dictates of that particular state. So just giggles here. These are a series of states where what we have are state religious freedom restoration acts. So in other words, you're allowed to be a bigot on religious grounds in these states. So those 20 states had these freedom of religion laws prior to 2015, and these sort of mustard-coloured states, sorry about the colour, are currently thinking about it. This is another one, a little bit naughty, but there we go. I'll cut to the chase here. You can find this GIF on Wikipedia. But what we see here is the growing illegalization of bestiality. Those states where it's green, there are no laws on bestiality. Those states where it's red, it is a felony. And you can see how the pattern has changed even in the last 17 or so years. Gradually, this is being phased out, but it is a long process. And by the time we get to 2018, we'll see that there are still a couple of states where it's legal to be very, very friendly with your horse. Anyway, let's push on. So what is federalism? This is your definition of federalism, system of government, blah, 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 blah. You can pause that and read it in your own time. The general rule of federalism, however, is that states run themselves, except when they don't. I wouldn't necessarily put that in an essay like that, but if you remember that yourself, then you're going to be able to answer a question that, by and large, the states are supposed to get on with it. The job of the federal government is like the parents. Their job is to essentially manage the house and the international finances and to stop the kids from killing each other. So that's a useful metaphor, and a useful way to try to remember that is that the states manage themselves except when they don't. Primacy attends to the states. This is one of our constitutional principles. And the federal government is perceived largely as a necessary evil. What they are there to do, as I said earlier, is to protect the house and to stop the kids from killing one another. Oops, well, no, there we go. So why do we have federalism? Now, you just have to, again, learn these. This question comes up from time to time. I can't recommend this particular presentation here, Laboratories of Democracy, highly enough. That is on the BBC Compass website. Well worth seeking out. They've got 4 different lectures there, one of which is Laboratory of Democracy. They're all very, very good. But in terms of federalism, then that's absolutely brilliant. Again, just learn these, come back, remember these. They do come up from time to time in essays. So if you've got those up your sleeve, then you can't go far wrong. This really is coming at it the other way. The general idea of federalism is that one size fits all laws. Now, these are obviously issued by the federal government, whereas the state laws is all about what's right for the states. Obviously, Texas needs laws to deal with deserts. Alaska needs laws to deal with avalanches. And, they don't necessarily need to have the same laws. That would just be silly. You don't get many polar bears in Texas. You don't get many rattlesnakes in Alaska. Not that polar bears or rattlesnakes tend to be that bothered by law, but I think you know what I mean. So, again, the general idea being that states should run themselves and the federal government is there as a necessary evil to manage foreign policy and interstate business. So, as I said, we have that sort of fractal structure of government. We have the one federal government, we have 50 state governments, and then those little councils. And of course, in each of these, you've got your legislature, your judiciary, and your executive. We know all about those in the federal government. That's not a problem. But it's probably worth mentioning, of course, that every state has its own legislature. Each state runs its own legislature differently. There's no set size. Some of them have got just a handful of members, others have got a couple of hundred. Most of the laws that people live under in the United States are dominated by or set by your state government. And if you do get the time, look up the John Oliver program. I'll try to remember to link off on it about state elections. It's very, very funny and terrifying in equal measure, like a lot of the stuff he does. Of course, the other relevant point there is at your state level, your executive is your governor. And we all remember Governor Schwarzenegger, Governor Jesse Ventura. No one else from Predator has made it to governor yet, but hey, there's still time. So, there we go. Americans are subject to 3 sets of rules. The Constitution. Everybody has to abide by the Constitution. Then you've got your federal laws, and then you've got your state laws. And essentially that's your sort of hierarchy. Everything has to be consistent with each other. We've got a constitution at the top, federal there, and state laws. Those need to be consistent with that. That needs to be consistent with that. And of course, that needs to be consistent with that as well. Now, that's the simple bit. The tricky bit is what happens when they come into conflict. And that really is where we start to see things getting very, very interesting. Before we get that, let's just have a look at the Constitution generally. Worth mentioning that the word federal does not actually feature in the Constitution at all, but in spite of that, there are various aspects of the Constitution that reflect the federal model. The Senate is a very good representation of federalism in that everyone gets 2 representatives, or 2 senators, let's call them that. So we have 2 senators. Article 4, explicit recognition of the states, blah, 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 blah. And of course, the Electoral College is all about state rights as well. We also know that the federal government divides power up, and the Constitution, divides power up into state government, state powers, and federal powers, and we'll come and look at that in a second. And in terms of procedures, there are various aspects there that are outlined in the Constitution that relate to federalism as well. Right, so the Constitution of Federalism, sources of power. Each government has its own allocated power. The federal government has what we call enumerated powers, and if it's not in there, then you can't do it. So that's really rather important. The state, on the other hand, have what we call reserve powers. That is, anything not explicitly granted to the federal government applies to the states. And then in addition to that, just to confuse things a bit, we have concurrent powers. The best way to do this is really to look at this. Money is a good one. Money is a good one to look at. So we have coining money. You want to know that your money is consistent from state to state to state. However, you can have federal banks and you can have state banks. So both states and federal government can establish their own banks, and both of them can also tax. So these are your delegated powers. These ones are written into the Constitution, and if it's not there, then the federal government can't do it. Everything not in there is explicitly granted to the states, and so these are called reserve powers. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I rather like this quotation here from James Madison, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have included it. But you can read that in your own time, so hit pause, read that, and then we can move on. Okay, this is your classic federalism model. It's called layer cake federalism, and it's the one that was sort of in the minds of the founding fathers, we presume, when they drew it up. So we have the federal powers. These are, again, your enumerated powers, your concurrent powers, and your state powers. And you'll see these are all nicely, clearly demarcated, so no one gets confused at all. So the federal government does its thing, the states do its thing, and then between them we have the concurrent powers, where occasionally there's a little bit of overlap. That's layer cake federalism, the pure federalism model, and again, that attended from the drafting of the Constitution, 1789-91, through to pretty much the New Deal. Here are some examples. In 1895, the Supreme Court declares that the federal income tax that they had passed was unconstitutional. So Congress responded by proposing the 16th Amendment. The Constitution did not give the federal government the right to impose an income tax initially. However, the 16th Amendment changed it such that they could do. Then we have various illustrations here of reserve powers. It's not in the Constitution, and so it deferred to the states. And both Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson, these were to deal with specific issues. In this case, in the Dred Scott case, of course, that was slavery, and Plessy versus Ferguson was segregation. Again, 1857, nothing in the Constitution about slavery. So hey, have a slave. Obviously that was later amended by the 13th and 13th Amendment in particular. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. This is to do with segregation. Nothing in the Constitution about segregation. So hey, go and segregate, said the Supreme Court. Separate but equal, absolutely fine. So in these particular cases, we have the idea that the Supreme Court looks at the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution about these ideas, so it's fair game for the states. Okay, so this is where it starts to get complicated. Where conflict arises, this normally appears in one of four specific areas, either disputes arising from the Supremacy Clause, the Elastic Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, or the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause. And because I think I'm going to overrun on these, I'm going to park that there, and we'll come back and look at the second half of this presentation in a separate video.